Hello, and welcome to Politics and Pastimes, which is the last time you're going to hear that name because we are actively seeking a new name. Last week, we didn't introduce ourselves because we had a 10-minute introduction and we wanted to make sure that the show was an hour long. So we're going to try and keep this short and sweet. I'm Justin. I am the center right, millennial, anti Trumper.
I'm Jonathan. I am a college professor, so you might guess that I probably skew a little bit further left on domestic politics. I have an interesting combination of views because my international relations policy tends to be a little bit more hawkish than you might expect. Certainly more of a realist kind of view than Democratic Party traditionally goes for.
We met on a video game forum, and we just discussed politics on a video game forum, and we became fast friends because I really like the insight that he has. And well, do I add any insight?
I appreciate that, but I like. I mean, as you can probably tell, Justin's quite a bit younger than I am. So I like to keep myself a little bit fresher by interacting and talking with people and having friends who are not in the same age group. And I think I like the perspective that Justin brings. He brings a much different perspective than than I just talk to people my own age. And it's also been very interesting to watch Justin's evolution in politics. Before Trump came along, I can't imagine he ever considered he would even entertain the idea of voting for a Democrat.
Yeah, I had a Donald Rumsfeld tattoo and everything, right?
There you go. But it's been very interesting, and I think both of us have sort of really meshed pretty well in terms of talking with each other. We are. I mean, I like having friends that have any kind of place on the political spectrum because it's fun to disagree and it's fun to challenge each other, and I think we both do that pretty well. And we are both kind of people that don't get angry about that. Right. It's hard to find people like that to be friends with, and those are friends you want to keep.
Exactly. So for today's episode, we're going to discuss the Veepstakes. We're going to discuss Biden's Supreme Court reform, and for dessert, we're going to be discussing green chili and Cerveza. So stay tuned. All right. So for our first segment today, I wanted to discuss something that I think is pretty important, but it hasn't really gotten the coverage I think it deserves. One of the things that we try to do here is look for signals in the vast array of political events that have occurred to see if we can find any sort of long-term trends that are worthy of discussion. So on Monday, President Biden announced his proposal for Supreme Court reform. So briefly, he wants to have a constitutional amendment that will strip presidents of absolute immunity. He wants to have term limits for the Supreme Court justices. So basically, every president is going to appoint two justices every year. Sorry, two justices every presidential term. And they will serve 18-year terms. And then also a binding ethics code for SCOTUS. Obviously, the chances of this passing now are slightly above 0%. So,
maybe
you could ask, yeah. So you could ask, why are we covering it, right? From my perspective, Joe Biden has always been an institutionalist. He has resisted calls for filibuster reform. And I think he's someone who's almost always at the center of his party. So for him to come out and support these, pretty drastic reforms, I think is a pretty big deal. And it shows where the party's going. And obviously, Kamala Harris has endorsed this. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries has endorsed this. And Senate Majority Leader Schumer has his own version of what he's trying to do. We could discuss that in a bit. But I do think this is gaining steam for the Democrats.
Well, I think you're right that it's an interesting issue, and it's something that we'll probably hear about more. But I just, when I see it come out right now, it's sort of seems like a little bit of, we aren't really happy with the decisions we got today, right? So we're mad at the Supreme Court. This is what we're going to do. Historically speaking, Right? Supreme Court reform has not gone very well for the Democrats for the past 100 years or so when FDR tried to, or was prepared to stack the court. So it's I don't, I'm not sure that it's a serious proposal or just something that they wanted to throw out there for the political impact of it. Um, it would be an interesting proposal. I mean, there's all kinds of. I mean, it's not the only proposal. There have been lots of proposals people have been putting out for doing something about the Supreme Court, and I think to me, it's something ought to be done. But I'm not sure exactly how you do it without coming across as, hey, this is what we think would be better for us politically if we made these reforms, and a lot of like Biden's also talking about hand in hand with the constitutional amendment to remove the president's immunity. Putting those two things together kind of at the same time leads me to think it's a little more political than a serious, sober reflection on how we can make the Supreme Court better.
Sure, I can definitely understand that. Clearly, the immunity case is the straw that broke the camel's back.
Mm-hmm.
Biden commissioned this, I think, back in 2021, and it was sort of a way to keep the progressives like happy. It was like, okay, fine, we're going to investigate this, and then do absolutely nothing about it. Right? There is a 300-page document. I've read a lot of it. It's fairly dry, and it goes into some of the difficulties of passing some of these reforms. So one of the things I want to talk about has the highest chance of passing is the binding ethics code for SCOTUS. When it comes to favorability, it's really important that the Supreme Court has high favorability because they don't have any enforcement mechanism. So if the people lose trust in the Supreme Court, that gives the executive branch and Congress I don't want to say authority, but it gives them a little bit of flexibility to, give them the finger. And, obviously we don't want that. It would be nice if we treated them as a sacrosanct institution. The unfavorability rating increased drastically when the Dobbs leak occurred, and then it came back down to about 50-50. And then once ProPublica released the Clarence Thomas gifts, we can call it a scandal, and the Alito fishing trip, that basically caused the unfavorability rating to skyrocket and never recovered. So it's important that people believe that SCOTUS holds themselves accountable for any sort of potential impropriety. And, I know that they say they adhere to it, but it would be nice to have an enforcement mechanism. And that's what
the
this
question is. That I always keep coming back to with something like that is, what would this enforcement mechanism be? Who would enforce it? And if you say, well, if it's the executive would enforce it or somebody like that, who's to say the executive wouldn't enforce it incorrectly or improperly? I mean, if for example, you had a Democratic Supreme Court and Donald Trump was president, right? Would you trust that he wouldn't use his power of ethics enforcement over the Supreme Court to further some goals that he had? And would you trust all Democrats would not do that if they didn't like what a Republican Supreme Court was doing? This whole sort of proposal implies that the Democrats are not happy with the Supreme Court, right? It's not like they woke up one day and like, you know what? The Supreme Court really needs some reform. No, they're quite unhappy with what the Supreme Court's doing. I'm not sure how you create a binding ethics code that doesn't at least have the potential to make it worse.
Right. That's a good point. There are also constitutional issues as well. Powers vested in one Supreme Court in Article 3 is, pretty powerful. And a lot of these reforms hinge on that interpretation. And there's no consensus. So that is one
and the
thing.
Supreme Court would ultimately have to rule on it.
Right. Yeah.
It would go to the Supreme Court. It's like, what do you think about our plans to regulate you? Are these okay?
So yeah, and that's the thing that has the highest chance of passing. So now let's go to the other things that have a much smaller chance. The term limits is interesting. Again, constitutional issues. There are some clever ways to perhaps get around it. The I guess you can call it committee, basically said, okay, what you can do is you can say you'll have 9 junior justices. And then once you serve out your 18-year terms, you become a senior justice, in which case you're no longer ruling on these issues, and you go back to a circuit court and just do your work there. The other alternative would be almost to have like a panel where the 9 justices hear the appellate jurisdiction cases, which is 98%. So basically, any case that starts in the district court, it funnels up to the appellate court and then eventually to the Supreme Court. There are also original jurisdiction cases, which are fairly rare, though they do happen. That's basically like, the ambassador of Germany has a beef with something, or Kansas has a beef with Louisiana, something along those lines. Again, constitutional issues. There is support for it on both sides. Funnily enough, Ted Cruz supported Supreme Court limits
you can't cite Ted Cruz as your supportive authority there.
After the Obergefell decision, but suddenly he doesn't support them anymore. Can't imagine why.
So here's another issue that when I look at this, it's like, if you want term limits for Supreme Court justices, that seems I could see that. I could see you can, but then you start to have this weird system where you might not apply to current justices. You're going to have a junior system and a senior system. You're going to have original and people don't. That's a hard sell. Right, when you've got to get into explaining all these details.
Well, I don't think you need to explain that to them. I think the way you sell it is they have term limits.
No, right. If you just say we're going to put in, and why do you need to have each president is appointing 2 justices in a term? It's like, because as we know, it's become sort of vogue in the Supreme Court never to retire. Right, they stay in there till they die, and even if you have term limits, people will die. What do you do if you've appointed your 2 and then somebody dies? And then do they get a full 18-year term, or do they get the remainder of the existing term? And it's like, I just...
Right. I mean, those are details, right? Those are details I don't think the people care about, right? I think you would just grab, the most recently retired, senior justice, because that would be the shortest term, right? And then they sit on the court until the vacancy is filled next time. I mean, there are ways to get around that.
I think if you're going to have reform, you should just do it as simply, because the thing they really want, we want to get rid of some of these people, basically, and we don't want somebody to be able to stack the court forever. Okay, term limits. I agree. Justice Clarence Thomas should not still be on the court. He was on the court when I lived in Washington, D.C., and that was over 30 years ago.
Yeah, he was confirmed, 91 or 92? It's been a while.
Yeah. And he's not evolved along with the country. Let's say that. We can be charitable and say that about him. But I would be, if I was in charge of this proposal, I would say this is far too complicated. We're making it too complex. What we really want to do, we should have term limits.
Right. But I think the complexity arises simply because they want to try and pass this via statute as opposed to a constitutional amendment. If you had a constitutional amendment, then it could be that simple, right? But the issue is they know how difficult it is to pass a constitutional amendment, and therefore they need to come up with a clever way to get what they want.
Do you think there's any way that the Supreme Court, as currently established, would say this passes constitutional muster?
Most certainly not, but I think it's worth a shot if they have the votes to do it.
Well, which I don't think either one of us think they have the votes.
And in a way, it kind of mirrors, when FDR threatened to pack the court, right? He threatened to pack the court, and then they relented, right? Yeah. So this could be a way of saying, "Hey, you know what? I dare you to rule this unconstitutional."
They knew FDR could pack the court if he really wanted to. They know that the Democrats can't do any of these things.
I suppose that's fair. So it's almost like an empty threat, but then the credibility of the court goes down even more. And then you start running into those constitutional crises that we talked about where, people just give them the finger. and we absolutely don't want to. Roberts especially does not want that to happen. So then, let's talk about the least likely one to occur, which is a constitutional amendment. That presidents are not immune. I don't know how much there is to discuss. There's wide support for this on both sides. Honestly, I think the only thing that's stopping it from actually passing is the fact that Trump is alive and it's tied to Trump. I think that once Trump is dead, 10 years from now, we could look at this and be like, yeah, we really should have this. Let's just make it clear. It's not controversial, and then maybe it'll happen. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Kamala Harris's potential vice presidential picks, the Veepstakes. We're going to organize this based on probability of being chosen according to Polymarket, because there's a lot of money on the line. So number one at 71% chance is Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. So what's his story? Basically, he started out in the Pennsylvania House of Reps and then became county commissioner of Montgomery County, which is in the Philly suburbs. He was known as a consensus builder, getting things done, received high praise from both Republicans and Democrats. Then he became Attorney General of Pennsylvania, and this is where he really became a national figure among the political elites. He released a grand jury report on the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandal. He brokered $1 billion settlement with Johnson & Johnson regarding opioids. And then he became governor in 2022 against one of the MAGA types, Doug Mastriano. And he's been a very popular governor ever since. I think his approval rating is hovering in the low 60s, which in a polarized environment is fairly incredible. So it makes sense why he would be on the short list. He's a fairly charismatic speaker, really gets to the point whenever he speaks. Some of his positions include, supporting more police. He's not part of that defund the police effort. He's very pro-choice, believes in giving increased access for abortion care. He supports unions, is anti-right to work. The only caveat to that is that the teachers' unions aren't too happy with him because he supports school voucher programs, which is surprising for a Democrat, to say the least. Another thing that he is known for was getting I-95 back up and running. We had that bridge collapse a couple years ago, and I think it only took 2 weeks for it to be operational again. So he gets a lot of credit for that. He's strongly pro-Israel, and we'll talk about that in a minute because that's going to be one of the knocks on him. So what do you think, Jonathan?
Well, I think he checks a couple of the boxes, right? He's the standard, and we'll talk how important these things are later after we talk about the candidates, but he's the classic, comes from a swing state politician. Very popular in the swing state. Pennsylvania, very important. There's very few, if any, ways Kamala Harris can come on. I'm going to mispronounce it repeatedly. I've been hearing Donald Trump say her name too often. In any case, I don't think she can win without winning Pennsylvania. So that makes a lot of sense. He's also very moderate. And for whatever reason, Kamala is perceived as not so moderate. Very, very far.
Can't imagine why.
Well, again, I was reading interesting articles where in the cesspool of liberals and pinkos where you live, she's actually considered fairly moderate in terms of Democrats. For in a couple pieces I was reading, it weren't exceptionally persuasive, but you can understand that there are far more radical California politicians than her. But in any case, nationally speaking, it would be a good job. It would be an asset for her to have somebody else on the ticket who is perceived as more moderate. And I think he checks both of those pretty well. I think you're correct in noting that some of his policy positions are problematic with the very left of the party, right? the support for Israel, the school voucher program. Those are kind of things that progressives get very worked up about. And it's interesting. I shared with you an article that I was reading today on The Hill, which, for those of you that don't read it, you don't really need to, but it's very, very politically oriented and pro right wing. So they're worried about Shapiro, and they're trying to make everybody believe, oh, the progressives don't want Shapiro. They're trying to get on that bandwagon as well, which is kind of
There's
funny.
a little bit of astroturfing there because
Yes.
I do think the Republicans fear Shapiro the most.
Yes, I agree.
And I do think that the anti-Israel thing, or sorry, the pro-Israel thing, is a bit overstated. He got in a little bit of hot water by comparing anti-Semitism and to racism. So what I mean by that is he said, Indian... how would you feel if the KKK came in with their masks and started harassing black students, right? And we want to, kind of set the record straight and say, hey, most of the student protesters are not anti-Semitic in any way, shape, or form. There are quite a few who, we can call them useful idiots, who really engage in some highly questionable behavior. And there are some outright bigots out there. And I think based on the interview, and we've both read the transcript and watched the interview, it's clear to me that he's talking about those specific people who are actual bigots, but I can understand why some would conflate his comments with student protests in general. Yeah, and I think that's unfair.
Well, I think it's a very unartful use of language, right? It's kind of, sure. To me, it really resonated with the idea of when anybody ever refers to Hitler, you've gone off the rails.
Right.
And the Klan isn't quite as bad, but it's the same kind of thing. It's like, aha, but what if it was the Klan? It's like, yeah, but it wasn't, right? Or, but what about Hitler? Hitler's not involved in this. The Klan is not involved in this. Talk about the merits. And more politicians would do well to take that advice and not throw in these silly little metaphors or similes or comparisons they want to use to show how bad something is. Because it's different. It's just qualitatively different. And he shouldn't have done that. That said, I agree with you that, what, there is, in any large group, really, there are going to be idiots, right? And there are going to be reprehensible people. Democrats, Republicans, moderates, everybody is going to have their share. And to bring up the point that, hey, you know what, we want to make sure that the extremists don't go too far. I don't have a real problem with that. I didn't like his KKK metaphor. I just thought that was just silly. And it took away from his argument. It made his argument seem preposterous when it was an interesting argument to make.
Right. Because in the same interview, he said that Benjamin Netanyahu is the worst Israeli leader of all time. Mm-hmm. And he made sure to always pair anti-Semitism with Islamophobia. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you should do, right? There's no place in our society for either one.
Agreed.
And so, yeah, I think the attacks on him are a little unfair in that regard.
I also don't think they're all that important. For what Kamala Harris is trying to do potentially, if he were the pick, right? The people she's trying to appeal to, they're not going to hold that against him.
Right.
And we're hearing less about it, fortunately. They're like, oh, we can't ever vote for Joe Biden because he supported Israel. It's like, well, you know what? Donald Trump supports Netanyahu much more than Joe Biden. You're going to go vote for him, right? So,
but you could always choose the couch, right? You don't want people to stay at home. But at the end of the day, all the VP candidates that we're going to discuss have the exact same position as Shapiro, right?
Yeah, more or less.
I do think that him being Jewish kind of makes people go, oh, like it magnifies the issue of supporting Israel, which is unfair, but that is a reality we have to live with. But, someone like Mark Kelly, who we're going to discuss later on, he actually voted to send more weapons to Israel, and he's not going to get this level of scrutiny that Shapiro is. But, again, fair or unfair, that is the perception that you have to deal with. And that's what politics is, perception. I do want to add one thing that I thought was really neat, and it goes into this theme of appealing to the white working class, is that he removed the 4-year college degree requirement for working in government. And I think that's just common sense, right? If you want to do some sort of administrative level stuff, I can understand having a college degree, but there are a lot of jobs where it's just not needed.
Sure.
And if you can pass, the whatever civil service exams that they have, pass the interview process, what have you, you know what, the best candidate should get the job. And if that candidate didn't go to college, fine. I think that's just a common sense thing. And it really speaks to how he's just a consensus builder, right? He just gets stuff done.
Now, what do you think about the sexual harassment allegation?
Well, he didn't do it, right? So that's a big plus.
Why don't you? Can you give some? Maybe you should give some details.
Yeah. So the background of that is that someone on his transition team was accused of sexual harassment, and then they settled that suit for close to around $250,000 of taxpayer dollars, right? You know what? The reality is these things happen. How much he knew about it, we will never know, because that's kind of the terms of the settlement. I just don't think people are going to care. Like the people who don't want Shapiro are going to bring it up, but you know what? It's not like Michael Bloomberg, where he was the one who settled because for his actions, right?
Yep.
You know, this was someone that he knew. And you know what? These things happen, and he did the right thing. He got him to resign, and then they settled, and that was that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, again, it's not like, well, if you're outraged by this person's sexual harassment somewhere embedded deep within his staff, or whoever was in the staff, could be right at the top, you're not going to say, you know what? I'm outraged. I'm going to go vote for Donald Trump and his very, very pious campaign and record.
And I don't think you're going to stay at home either. Like, no, you're just not.
I don't.
Like, this is what we want, though, right? Like, the whole point of the Me Too movement is accountability, and I think resigning and again, we don't know the details of the allegation. It could be really bad. It could just be innocuous comment that just got taken out of context. We don't know. It could be anything between there.
Well, I think we should assume that since it was settled, that there was something behind it.
Yeah, for sure, right? Something there.
I think that's, and I think that's as far as we can go. There was something that happened, but he got rid of the person, and then they had an arrangement with the accuser, and that's all you can. I think all you can ask for.
That's accountability, and that's what we should strive for. And honestly, you can look this up on YouTube. In our show notes, we have some clips, including the one where he discusses Israel. So please listen to that to be more informed and just to get a sense of how he speaks and delivers. I think that's also really important.
All right. So the next candidate we want to talk about is Andy Beshear, governor of Kentucky. Whereas, Shapiro is the consensus builder. And then we have the American hero and Mark Kelly, and sort of like the rural guy, the everyman in Walz. We've got Beshear, who's kind of like, he has an ability to reach the red state Americans that the Democrats traditionally, or not traditionally, but recently haven't had any success with at all. He's managed to win as a Democrat in Kentucky, which is not quite as remarkable as if you were able to win, say, like as Joe Manchin in West Virginia, but it's pretty close, right? He and I believe his lieutenant governor are the only statewide Democrats that have office in Kentucky, and he's doing something right? If he can appeal to these people that most Democrats can't, that's a very attractive trait to have as a running mate. He comes from a political family. His father was governor before him, so there's a little bit of the nepotism thing going on there, but it does increase his name recognition, at least in Kentucky, not so much outside of Kentucky. He was attorney general before he was governor, so he has got a history of statewide office, and he was he liked to confront his predecessor as governor in Kentucky, and then ended up beating him in a very close election. That guy was the least popular governor in the country at the time, so there were some sort of factors that conspired to make it more likely that he could win, but still quite an accomplishment to pull off. He's very moderate in a lot of ways, in ways, again, that would add a more moderate touch to the ticket. But he's also confrontational, right? He vetoed a lot of things, has vetoed a lot of things as governor. In 2021, I was reading he vetoed 27 things, and they were all overridden by the very Republican state houses in Kentucky. So he knows he's going to lose things, but he'll do it anyway. He'll do it to make a point. He supported trans rights, for example, by vetoing a couple bills about trying to prohibit trans care for children, things like that. Vetoed those, also overridden. Um, but he has a number of policies that, standard Democratic policies like support for abortion, had a strong reaction to COVID, which was fairly controversial in Kentucky. He's legalized medical marijuana, but he also he opposed assault rifles, right? He favored red flag laws, but opposes banning assault rifles. He wants clean coal, which again is kind of not a thing, but he thinks we should have clean coal while we're supporting the environment, and have new jobs for these people that are going to lose their jobs from coal going away. He also restored rights to more felons, something I didn't know until I started looking into it deeper, more rights to felons than any other governor, right? So he's done a lot about restoring voting rights to felons after they've served their time. So fairly moderate policies, but also fairly left-wing policies. I think that one is one, just to kind of jump into what does he bring and what are his strengths and weaknesses. If you want to be the law and order prosecutor, right? And it's a little weird fit to bring in a guy that's restored rights to the most felons in the country. You can make it work. You just have to spin it the right way. But that's the kind of thing that the Republicans are sure to pounce on if he's the vice presidential candidate, as well as a policy that just seemed a little creepy at the time when I remember hearing about it. He had the state troopers track people who went to church during COVID when they weren't supposed to and write down license plates.
That's kind of surprising. I mean, he won re-election too with that knowledge.
Yeah, that's true. But it wasn't the full-blown Republican machine that would be going after him for this now. That would be a Fox News item, I guarantee you.
Oh, 100%. And I think another thing to point out is that he expanded Medicaid in the state.
Yes.
So, that's the Obamacare thing. And honestly, Obamacare is popular when you don't say Obama, right? Yeah. That's what it boils down to in red states. And I think a lot of these rural Democrat types understand that implicitly. And so they really hone in their message to talk about, kitchen table issues and say, hey, you know what? We're going to make sure that you have healthcare coverage when you're postpartum. Yeah. You say it like that, who's going to say no? Besides J.D. Vance, apparently.
Oh, I'm sure he's got another plenty of people that would be happy to do that too. Yeah, and so I think I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think that's his big appeal, is that he has figured out a way that's worked for him to reach people that most Democrats can't. Right? Yep. He doesn't offer a swing state. Right? There's no chance Kentucky is voting for anyone but Donald Trump in this election. Right? Zero chance. So Beshear doesn't check that box, but he does give sort of outreach that can be across states, right, to this group of people that he managed to reach in Kentucky. Those people exist in every state, and certainly in all the swing states. And if he can help the Harris campaign reach those people, that's definitely an asset.
Right. And he plays the banjo.
Well, so yeah.
He's the red whisperer, as far as I'm concerned.
Fun
Democrats...
fact, my grandfather played the banjo back in the Depression. There's a fun fact for the day.
I think so I was very bullish on Beshear last week. I thought he was the best candidate. But part of the job of being vice president is that you have to skillfully be able to communicate the message of the president without outshining the president, right? And based on his interviews, like, he did fine, he didn't do anything wrong, but you could tell he's just not in the same tier as someone like Shapiro, who has that commanding presence, where it's just like, wow, this guy's a leader. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that Beshear is not a leader. It's just that the way he communicates it's just less effective.
But I think one of the things that sort of I didn't get caught up in, but there was a lot of, hey, he could be our anti-J.D. Vance. It's like, okay, but that's almost inconsequential to what's going on here, right? People aren't going to, Donald Trump came out and said he didn't think J.D. Vance mattered at all for the election. And I think he's probably right. His supporters aren't going to say, well, you know what? He picked J.D. Vance, so I can't vote for Donald Trump. That's not going to be a thing. And to pick somebody just because they're the anti-vice presidential pick on the other side, that doesn't seem to be as much of an asset as I think people were trying to talk it up as in some of the initial speculation.
Right. And I think, like, at the end of the day, you have to do well in the debate, the VP debate, right? Mm-hmm. You can't get crushed like Biden did to Palin, right? That just can't happen. I don't think Vance would defeat Beshear necessarily, but I do think that some of these other candidates, Shapiro, Walz, they would absolutely crush Vance. They're just much more effective communicators in that regard.
It's possible, yeah. But I think you can get beaten pretty badly. Look at Dan Quayle, right? But you can't get beaten as badly as Sarah. So there's sort of a difference. Right. You can be kind of bad, but you can't be catastrophically bad. And I don't think Beshear would be catastrophic.
No, he would not be,
even if he did lose.
No, I think he would probably win because
if he did,
he appears more authentic, right?
Yeah.
I think his quote is something along the lines of, "J.D. Vance isn't one of us." You know,
yeah.
He left. He went to Yale, and he never left. You know what? So that could resonate to some degree. And again, we have some Andy Beshear clips in our show notes, so feel free to watch them and make your own opinion about them. Okay, now number 3, according to Polymarket, is Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Walz has a very interesting background. He is sort of an everyman in that he grew up in rural Nebraska, then moved to rural Minnesota. He enlisted in the Army National Guard. He was a football coach, teacher, principal. One interesting tidbit about him is that he was the highest ranking enlisted person ever elected to Congress. He retired as a master sergeant. And that's just something you don't really see these days. Most members of Congress who have military experience are commissioned officers. They're pilots. They lead a platoon, something like that.
Swift boats.
Swift boats. He was not that. So that would be a very interesting thing to have on your resume. He then served in the House of Representatives towards the end of the Bush administration and the entire Obama administration. His voting score was somewhere between 0.44 and 0.46, which is pretty moderate for a Democrat. So nothing scary, right? He's a fairly moderate / conservative Democrat. But he was always, very pro-labor, pro-healthcare, pro-choice. I think he really embodies the term popularism, which is not populism. It's basically campaigning on things that are popular, that just help, the average Joe without the, nativism that often comes with populism. One thing I should point out is that he voted against TARP, Troubled Assets Relief Program, which is what it was one of the last things the Bush administration passed. It had a lot of Democratic support, and he voted against it mainly because it didn't do much to address the homeowners. So again, that ties into his everyman appeal. He's the current governor of Minnesota. He was governor during a very contentious time. As we all know, George Floyd was murdered in Minnesota, and he had to deal with all that, the rioting, the reactions. I can't say that he did the job perfectly. You could argue that he didn't deploy the National Guard quick enough, but he didn't do a catastrophic job either. I wouldn't even say he did a bad job. We could. I'm not from Minnesota, but based on what I've read, I would say he got a solid B in managing that, which in terms of crisis is good. Part of the job is, as an executive, is to be able to handle crises and not mess up. So he had some meaningful reforms, such as banning chokeholds. He funded peace officers who deal with mentally ill, as opposed to just shooting someone who's having a mental breakdown. He's definitely against defund the police. Now, from a legislative standpoint, he had a really, really big year and passed just an immense amount of popular pieces of legislation. So legalize cannabis, universal background checks on guns, requiring paid leave, codifying abortion rights. And then he also reformed the criminal justice system. So, increased diversion programs, reducing mandatory minimums. The effects of that remain to be seen, but they certainly aren't radical enough to paint him as someone who is, against policing, right? It definitely doesn't have that coastal district attorney vibe. These seem like sensible reforms that aren't going to that they're actually good, and you're not going to have people robbing Target and stealing $999.99 worth of stuff to avoid being charged, right? So, yeah.
No California get out of jail free card in Minnesota, huh?
Nope.
So when I think about Tim Walz, and obviously I'm spreading the wealth because I mispronounced his name too earlier, but I'm trying to think of like how he's going to appeal to basically the unconnected, the people who don't pay attention to politics, and those are the people that the Harris campaign needs to pull in, right? Will he resonate enough with them? I don't know if any, I'm not sure of the answer to any of that. But at least prior to the last couple of weeks, I had some notion that he was governor of Minnesota, but he was not forefront in my mind. And I read the news a lot.
Yeah, he existed, right?
Yeah. For people that don't follow the news regularly, it'd be like, who? Right.
But the reason his stock has gone up is because he's interviewed so well.
Yeah.
Again, do your homework, guys. Read the show notes. Watch the videos we have.
We're not going to have any tests. We can promise that.
But I found him to be really effective, and I sort of dismissed him immediately. I was just like, okay, like who's this guy? We don't need him to carry Minnesota. But the more I read his background and the more I listened to him speak, I was like, you know what? Like, I think he's the guy. I was team Andy Beshear last week. I think I'm team Walz now. He seems to, and progressives love him, which is funny because based on his background, he can be fairly conservative. And I think that's really powerful. If you can get the progressives and then the, rural white working class to like you, I think that's really powerful. And the more he's seen on TV, the more people are going to like him, I think. I think there was also one more thing that's kind of an interesting anecdote. He served as the Gay Straight Alliance advisor for a school back in 1999. So, imagine, this football coach, right? 1999, this is kind of like the peak Don't Ask, Don't Tell era. And he went out on a limb and said, you know what, fine, like I'll advise you. No one else is doing it. I'll do it. And I think that's pretty powerful. Maybe why progressives like him. Because in a way he's ahead of the time and he was still able to navigate something that was pretty taboo and might still be taboo in a lot of places in this country.
Yeah, certainly in some of the rural areas, I'm sure that it'd be much more challenging to be the person to lead in the forefront of that, especially in the 90s. So that does speak that is an interesting thing. I'm again, my just initial reaction is who, right? And Andy Beshear, I knew a little bit more simply probably because of his elections being close and all that, and that he's an anomaly. And then my brother lives in Cincinnati. My son lives right across the river in Kentucky now. I work in Cincinnati. So I'm a little bit more connected to Ohio and Cincinnati and Kentucky politics. But to me, it's it's a little bit more of a stretch with him to just resonate with people throughout the country, especially people that don't pay much attention. All right, so that brings us to Mark Kelly. He is, as I mentioned before, the sort of the classic American hero. Right, he's the son of two police officers. He was a Navy combat pilot, then he went on to be an astronaut. And if that's not enough, he married a congresswoman who then survived a horrible assassination attempt. So he was really in the public eye just for that. Not to mention his previous background. That sort of probably isn't too surprising for those of us who pay any attention to politics. His motivation for getting into politics is what happened. A lot of it is what happened to his wife, in addition to his history of public service, things like that. He is very moderate politically as well. Sort of a common theme running through all these guys, right? He's in favor of gun control, as we might imagine, right? He's pro-environment, but he's opposed to the Green New Deal. Okay, he opposes Medicare for all. At least he had. He's in favor of stronger border security, right? And he has favored in the past dropping the filibuster to support voting rights. He is strongly in favor as well, very non-democratic sort of orthodoxy of more oil and gas drilling to lower gas prices. Okay? And he helped tank President Biden's nominee for the Labor Department wage official a while back because he had a dispute over what they should do about gig workers. Right, this nominee really wanted to kind of go after the gig working environment and companies, and Kelly was basically opposed, right? So he's an interesting guy. Certainly fits the bill in terms of, hey, swing state guy from Arizona, right? Really the classic American hero to stand up and put on your ticket, pull people in that way, right? And he's very moderate, okay? He's really, another thing he does, he kind of inoculates Harris against border stuff too. He's very strong on border security. He's got a lot of stake in the border issues, being from Arizona, right? Arizona gets a lot of the, a lot of the border issues that other states in the country like Kentucky or Minnesota or Pennsylvania don't have to deal with. So
Minnesota has to deal with illegal Canadians all the time.
Well, that's true. I forgot about that. My oversight. But aside from the illegal Canadians coming over to like steal hockey pucks or something, Arizona has to deal with a little bit more. So he's got a little bit more authenticity and authority when he talks about the border stuff. To me, he makes a pretty good candidate with one really huge problem in that he's a senator in a state where you might not get another Democratic senator if he were to leave office. And the Senate balance is so tight that you never know what's going to happen. However, right, is it more important to try to win the presidency or more important to hold on to the Senate? It's hard to say one way or another. But my thinking would be if one of these other guys is just as good, I would lean that way just because then you don't have to worry about the Senate. If you're convinced he's that much better, then okay, roll the dice, see what you can do. Hope the Republicans keep nominating Carrie Lake once she loses again this time. Then all things could work out. If she's if she is the perennial Republican candidate, then we could have special election as long as we want.
Now, what is interesting though, he has an identical twin brother.
I read that too.
So if Mark
could run for Senate.
Exactly. And then no one will know the difference.
Exactly. It's like, which one are you voting for?
So I agree with this analysis. I don't think he really adds to the ticket in that way relative to the other folks. And another thing that's probably a knock on him is that he isn't known to support labor like the other three candidates are, right?
Yeah, that's not his thing.
Right.
Especially with the anti-gig work, with the gig work with
right. And then, there's something called the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act, which, bolsters, the right to organize in this country. He recently came out in support of it, ever since it came out that he was being vetted for vice president. So yeah, go figure. Again, great resume, right? He has a wonderful story. He can debate J.D. Vance and say, hey, you know what? I'm a decorated combat veteran. I fought in the Gulf War. I had the medals to prove it. But that's about it. I don't think his stance on border security is really going to do much. They're going to attack her for being border czar, and just because he's on the
Yeah.
ticket, I don't think it's going to be like, oh well, I guess we can't attack him.
That's very true.
I also don't think he's particularly charismatic. Right? He's fine. Right? He's not like awful, but again, compared to the other three candidates, he's just what does he add? And I know it would be really cool to have an astronaut vice president, but I think someone with executive leadership is just going to be much more important. And he's just hasn't been in the Senate long enough to even have any notable legislation passed. He's on the Veteran Affairs Committee, and he's co-sponsored certain pieces of legislation and whatnot, but he doesn't have the gravitas that someone who's like on the Judiciary Committee, chair of the Judiciary Committee, or chair of the Appropriations Committee, things like that. I think if he had more time in the Senate, there you could have a better argument for him. But right now he's just on the he's running. He's not running, but he's being vetted because of his resume, and that's basically it. He doesn't have many accomplishments.
Well, maybe legislative accomplishments.
Yeah,
he's got a lot of accomplishments.
That's what I mean.
That's why he's being
right.
vetted. Yeah,
exactly.
I know what you meant. Yeah, which I think is a good time. That we've covered that sort of the main contenders to just kind of go into what all this means anyway, right? And we've discussed this before that I'm sort of a skeptic in terms of the whole Veepstakes thing. It's like how much is this really going to matter? It's like if we talk about, hey, we need someone to deliver a state. Well, the last person to meaningfully do that was LBJ for Kennedy in 1960. Right? It doesn't seem to happen anywhere. And we've talked about, hey, you know what? As long as you're not bad, because you can be kind of bad, you can be Dan Quayle bad, but you can't be Sarah Palin bad.
Right.
And I don't think any of these guys would fit into that category.
We might even have a new metric, J.D. Vance bad.
There you go.
That remains to be seen. But
Trump thinks J.D. Vance bad is okay. And I think he's probably right. He's certainly right among the core Trump voters.
Right.
He remains to be seen if it has any impact on moderates. But I think sort of all this is sort of a way to get to the question, does it matter more for Harris than it usually does? Right? Because it's clear that she's going to pick a white man. Right? I don't think that's a coincidence. Right? And does that sort of stabilize the ticket for people that are thinking, ooh, I can't vote for a black /Indian woman for president, but she's got a white guy as vice president, so now I'm okay?
Yeah, she was full Indian and they became full black, right?
Who knows? But now there's a white guy, so all my worries are gone. It's like, how much is it going to help her? Are any of these candidates going to help or hurt her case?
Right. The number one rule is do no harm. Mm-hmm. None of these candidates harm the ticket. You might be able to argue, and I think weakly, that Shapiro harms the ticket, but I think his pluses in Pennsylvania completely dwarf whatever harm he would bring to the ticket. So yeah, I don't think you can go wrong with either of these. I am of the opinion that both Walz and Shapiro are tier 1A, 1B, with Walz being 1A, just due to that everyman aspect. And ultimately, it's really going to depend on where you think Pennsylvania polling is going to be, right? That is Harris's weakest state. So they might just, and that's why Shapiro is not polling the highest, but he has the highest likelihood, because Harris is so weak not so weak in Pennsylvania, but she is weakest in Pennsylvania. And so having Shapiro on the ticket, that 1% boost, it might help. And at the end of the day, you're in it to win it.
Yep. I think I'm of the same mind right now. It's like, you know what? It hasn't necessarily worked ever in the recent past.
But this time it will.
It can't hurt, right? I don't think don't think there's any examples where, hey, you picked the vice president and you've lost the state because of it.
Right.
So,
that won't happen here.
So she's not going to lose Pennsylvania because of him. He might help, and she really needs Pennsylvania to win. It'll be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for her to win if she doesn't win
Yeah,
Pennsylvania.
then you basically have to win Arizona, Georgia, and that
Nevada, every other
yeah
state,
yeah
and maybe even North
that's
Carolina.
that's tough. So yeah, we'll get into electoral maps. Once the races settle down around Labor Day. One thing I would like to note though is Biden does have strength among labor that Harris does not have. So I think that also gives a boost to Beshear, Walz, and Shapiro, and it kind of puts Mark Kelly in that next tier category because he's not anti-labor per se, but he's definitely not as pro-labor as the other guys. And Harris needs that. She needs to appeal to that white working class group that Biden actually does surprisingly well with. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. And well, hopefully she's in the process of getting this squared away so we don't have to speculate about it anymore. Next week we can talk about what
we'll know
means.
Tuesday. Watch, it's JB Pritzker, and then we're going to do a deep dive on him. I think the only I'm looking at Polymarket now. The only other person who is in reasonable single digits is Pete Buttigieg. He is being vetted. He's 2 points below Mark Kelly. But yeah, Josh Shapiro is running away with it at this point in time, followed by Beshear and Walz. So,
all right. So we'll give a little bit of credence, hopefully, to the political bettors. They're usually not completely off base. We should actually do a deep dive into that sometime because I'm sure a lot of people are hearing about this for the first time or don't know much about it. And I know you're very fond of the political betting.
Oh yes,
betting websites. So
we'll have to talk
about. We'll have to talk about that more in detail at some point. All right, so now we get to wrap up with the fun part of the program. So the beers you've seen us drinking today, I've got this one from Marble Brewing, and Justin's got one from Stone. These are Mexican
Buena Veza, which is a fun way of saying good beer.
Yeah, and so mine is just called Cerveza, but basically they're both Mexican lagers, and the reason we wanted to have those today is, one, it's hot as crap here still in Colorado. It's 98 today, so not particularly cool, and a good day to have a very refreshing beer. But it's also really good to cook with this time of year, especially in Colorado. We've got our own regional specialty. We and New Mexico kind of compete for who's the best green chili, and they say theirs are. We like ours. They're slightly different, but it's something we do with chilies this time of year every year, and make green chili out of it. It's kind of a take on classic Mexican chili verde, but it's much different. And here's some homework for you in the notes. I've got a recipe for it that I published on my website a while back. It's a beer and political satire website if you want to read about beer and political satire, but especially if you want to read about green chili. Got the recipe there. It's basically kind of a thick sauce sort of stew that you make with pork and roasted chilies. What we have in New Mexico as well, this time of year, when you go to like a farmer's market or something, there'll be bunches of people, and even Whole Foods that does this. They get a roaster. It's a big metal contraption that they turn with a crank and have propane flames underneath. And
you would shop at Whole Foods.
Come on, of course. Look, that's all you weren't even surprised. We know you're not surprised. And farmers markets too. So there you go. I do live in Boulder County after all. But in any case, they have these big metal things with propane burners underneath, and then they burn the crap out of these chilies to burn off, blacken the skin, and so you can peel it off. So you get rid of the skin and just have these roasted chilies that have a nice kind of smokiness to them, and use those as the base of it. I always start out, some people don't do this. They don't like it as thick. I like it a little thicker. So I make a roux, right, with flour and some olive oil to thicken it up just a bit. Chilies, tomatillos, tomatoes, spices. I like cumin, coriander, oregano, Mexican oregano if you had it. We have fresh oregano this year, so I use that from our garden. We have a little tiny garden on our deck where we do herbs. And then to link this together, I've replaced some of the broth in mine with beer. I like to put in a Pilsner or a lager. Mexican lager is the best that I've found. It's, one, it kind of gets you in the mood, but two, the flavors go really well with it. It doesn't overpower the other flavors, and it adds a little bit of depth with the malt that kind of comes through even after you've cooked it. You get a little bit of beer aftertaste in the chili once it's cooked. And it goes really well when you got one of these to polish it off with, because it gets a little hot, right? A little spicy, and you can tinker with it however you want. Lately, I've been adding ancho chili powder to it as well for just amp up the flavor a little bit. It's not as excessively hot, but it amps up the flavor a little. It's just a great sort of annual tradition we have. And in fact, on our trip to New Mexico recently, my wife and I we stopped in Pueblo for a burger they've called the Slopper Burger, which is their signature food in Pueblo, which is a burger covered with green chili and then whatever else they feel like throwing on, French fries, cheese, all kinds of stuff. But green chili is sort of, if Colorado is a signature dish, it's the green chili. And ours is a little thicker usually than New Mexico's. We have, sometimes you'll get New Mexico's. I've had stuff there that's like strips of green chili and much more of like a soupy kind of thing without even the pork in it. Ours is almost always pork based, unless you're vegetarian, in which case you'd leave it out. But it's just a nice way to top off like enchiladas. We always have that. We have cheese enchiladas we do with the green chili, or you can even eat it as a bowl, which we do on the next day. And we make a lot of it. So you have one day sauce with enchiladas, next day bowl of green chili. And then Mexican lager is always perfect with it. I like the Mexican lager for these kind of things because it is very crisp. It's not bitter by any stretch. It gives you usually like just a hint of sweetness to take off the bitter from very many hops, but that also goes really well with spicy food. Just a touch of sweet. I don't usually like a sweet beer, and this isn't a sweet beer by any stretch, but just a hint of the malt that kind of really plays well with knocking down the heat from something like a green chili.
So you mentioned meat and pork, and I agree that pork is probably the best choice for it. Now, do you use like pork cubes, or do you kind of use pork shoulder and almost have like a pulled pork texture?
No, for this, this is cubes, and what I usually get, you can just go to the store and get, if they have like pre-done pork stew meat is fine. But I just like I generally will get like pork loin chops or something, because I use a roux, so there's a lot of fat in the oil from that. It's not going to dry it out too much. You don't want stuff that's exceptionally lean, right? But stuff that's fairly well marbled and something.
So what about pork belly? That seems like that'd be too much.
Pork belly would be too much. That would be it. Yeah, it's basically you'd be getting uncured chunks of bacon. So what I do is like I'll brown all the pork. You can use shoulder. You can use any kind of. I wouldn't use like tenderloin. That's going too far. But any sort of chops, you just dice them up, brown them, take them out, make your roux, put them back in with the onion, with the onions and stuff, so you can get that all going, and then start adding your liquids.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week with a different name.
Yes, we're gonna have a good name next week.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.